Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump by Joseph S. Nye, Jr. Narrated by Robertson Dean. Preface. At dinner with a group of friends, one asked what I had been doing lately. When I said I was writing a book on presidents, ethics, and foreign policy, she quipped, "It must be a very short book." Another added more seriously, "I didn't think ethics played much of a role." That conventional wisdom marks not only dinner discussions, but political analyses as well. An internet search shows surprisingly few books on how presidents' moral views affected their foreign policies and how that affects our judgments of them. I use ethics and morals interchangeably to refer to judgments of right and wrong. Ethics are more abstract principles of right conduct, while morals usually refer to more personal judgments that may be based on formal ethics or personal conscience. As Michael Walzer, an important exception to the rule, described American graduate training after 1945, moral argument was against the rules of the discipline as it was commonly practiced, although a few writers defended interests as the new morality. A survey of the top 3 American academic journals on international relations over 15 years found only 4 articles on the subject. As one author noted, leading scholars do not dedicate serious attention to investigating the influence of moral values on the conduct of nations. It is not a career-enhancing topic for a young scholar, but has long intrigued me as an old practitioner and student of American foreign policy. The reasons for skepticism seem obvious to many. While historians have written about American exceptionalism and moralism, diplomats and theorists like George Kennan long warned about the bad consequences of the American moralist-legalist tradition. International relations is the realm of anarchy, with no world government to provide order. States must provide for their own defense, and when survival is at stake, the ends justify the means. Where there is no meaningful choice, there can be no ethics. As philosophers say, ought implies can. No one can fault you for not doing the impossible. By this logic, combining ethics and foreign policy is a category mistake, like asking if a knife sounds good rather than whether it cuts well, or whether a broom dances rather than sweeps well. By this logic, in judging a president's foreign policy, we should simply ask whether it worked, not also ask whether it was moral. While this view has some merit, it ducks hard questions by oversimplifying. The absence of world government does not mean the absence of all order. Some foreign policy issues relate to our survival as a nation, but most do not. Since World War II, the United States has been involved in several wars, but none were necessary for our survival, and many important foreign policy choices about human rights or climate change or internet freedom do not involve war at all. Most foreign policy issues involve trade-offs among values that require choices, not application of a rigid formula of raison d'etat. A cynical French official once told me, "I define good as what is good for the interests of France. Morals are irrelevant." He seemed unaware that his statement itself was a moral judgment. It is tautological, or at best trivial, to say that all states try to act in their national interest. The important question is how leaders choose to define and pursue that national interest under different circumstances. What is more, whether we like it or not, Americans constantly make moral judgments about presidents and foreign policy. The advent of the Trump administration has revived interest in what is a moral foreign policy and raised it from a theoretical question to front-page news. For example, after the 2018 killing of Saudi dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi Arabia consulate in Istanbul, President Trump was criticized for ignoring clear evidence of a brutal crime in order to maintain good relations with the Saudi crown prince. Liberals labeled Trump's statement about Khashoggi remorselessly transactional, heedless of the facts, while conservatives editorialized that we are aware of no president, not even such ruthless pragmatists as Richard Nixon or Lyndon Johnson, who would have written a public statement like this without so much as a grace note about America's abiding values and principles. Access to oil, sales of military equipment, and regional stability are national interests, but values and principles that are attractive to others are also national interests. How can they be combined? Unfortunately, many judgments about ethics and foreign policy are haphazard or poorly thought through, and too much of the current debate focuses on the personality of Donald Trump. As Maggie Haberman, a perceptive long-term reporter, once commented to me, Donald Trump is not unique, he is extreme. Some of his actions are not unprecedented, as we will see as we look at the record of all our presidents since the Second World War. Even more important, Americans are seldom clear about the criteria by which we judge a moral foreign policy. We praise a president like Ronald Reagan for the moral clarity of his statements, as though rhetorical good intentions are sufficient in making ethical judgments. However, Woodrow Wilson and George W. Bush showed that good intentions, without adequate means to achieve them, can lead to ethically bad consequences, such as the failure of Wilson's Treaty of Versailles or Bush's invasion of Iraq. Or we can judge a president simply on results. Some observers credit Richard Nixon for ending the Vietnam War, but he sacrificed 21,000 American lives to create a reputational decent interval that turned out to be an ephemeral pause on the road to defeat. Good moral reasoning, as I argue in this book, should be three-dimensional, weighing and balancing the intentions, the means, and the consequences of presidents' decisions. A moral foreign policy is not a matter of intentions versus consequences, but must involve both, as well as the means that were used. Moreover, good moral reasoning must consider the consequences of general actions, such as maintaining an institutional order that encourages moral interests, as well as particular newsworthy actions, such as helping a human rights dissident or a persecuted group in another country. And it is important to include the ethical consequences of non-actions, such as President Truman's willingness to accept stalemate and domestic political punishment during the Korean War, rather than follow General MacArthur's recommendation to use nuclear weapons. As Sherlock Holmes famously noted, we can learn a lot from the dogs that do not bark. This book is not a history. I make no effort to be complete or to consult all sources in describing the ethical aspects of presidents' foreign policies since World War II, nor do I attempt to cover the earlier centuries of American foreign policy. What I offer here is an exercise in normative thinking applied to the period since 1945, when the United States has been the most powerful country in the world, sometimes called the era of Pax Americana or the liberal international order. Many commentators speculate that this period is coming to an end, and that new foreign policies will be necessary to meet the new challenges that I describe in the final chapter. As we debate such policies, ethics will be one part of the arguments that we will use. To pretend that ethics will play no role is as blind as to imagine that the sun will not rise tomorrow. Since we are going to use moral reasoning about foreign policy, we should learn to do it better. The analysis and scorecards developed in this book are modest steps in that direction. Chapter 1. Introduction. American Moralism. In his 2017 inaugural address, Donald J. Trump proclaimed that, "From this day forward, it's going to be America first. America first. We will seek friendship and goodwill with the nations of the world, but we will do so with the understanding that it is the right of all nations to put their own interests first." That seems obvious. Leaders are trustees. We vote for them to protect our interests. But how should they define and represent our interests? How moral do we want our presidents to be in foreign policy? And what would that mean? Do we have duties beyond borders? Can we, indeed should we, try to make the world a better place? American exceptionalism. Americans have long seen our country as morally exceptional. As Theodore Roosevelt put it a century ago, Our chief usefulness to humanity rests on combining power with high purpose. Based on such ideas as ethnicity, America has long seen itself as a cause as well as a country. Belief that one's country is exceptional is a common form of nationalist pride. For some Americans, exceptionalism represents chauvinist pride and moral superiority, but for others, it simply means patriotism based on shared civic ideals combined with cooperative internationalism. Barack Obama expressed this modest moralism in 2009 when he said, "I believe in American exceptionalism, just as I suspect that the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism." But some Americans criticized Obama for the modesty of his claim. Stanley Hoffman, a Harvard political scientist who was both French and American, once pointed out that every country likes to think of itself as unique, but France and the United States stand out in their belief that their values are universal. France, however, was limited in its ambitions by the balance of power in Europe, and thus could not indulge its pursuit of universal values as much as it wished. In Hoffman's words, only the United States tried to develop foreign policies that reflect such exceptionalism and also had the leeway of power to do it. This does not mean that Americans were more moral than other peoples. Just ask Mexicans, Cubans, or Filipinos what they think of America's use of war and torture against them in the 19th century. But it does mean that many Americans want to believe that we are moral and a force for good in the world. Writing shortly after World War II, Hans Morgenthau, a realist with European roots, complained about this moralism in American foreign policy because it interfered with a clear analysis of power. Such moral sentimentalism, he said, was not limited to the mass public, but rather the attachment to the advancement of particular moral values reached to the highest levels of the American government, even as the United States took on the role of a superpower in the post-war world. Nonetheless, the fact that the United States had a liberal political culture made a huge difference to the nature of the international order that was established after World War II. Dominant powers promote their political values. Today's world would look very different if Hitler had emerged victorious in World War II, or if Stalin's Soviet Union had prevailed in the Cold War. Of the three great ideological narratives of the 20th century, fascism, communism, and liberalism, only the latter was left standing at its end. American exceptionalism has several sources. A major strand is the liberal Enlightenment ideas of the Founding Fathers. We are a nation built on those values. As John F. Kennedy put it, "The magic power on our side is the desire of every person to be free, of every nation to be independent. It is because I believe our system is more in keeping with the fundamentals of human nature that I believe we are ultimately going to be successful." Enlightenment liberalism valued the liberty and rights of the individual and believed such rights were universal, not merely limited to the American Republic. And some contemporary political scientists argue that the core reason that the United States is widely viewed as exceptional is because of its intensely liberal character, an ideological vision of a way of life centered upon freedom in politics, in economics, and in society. Right from the start, however, Americans faced contradictions in implementing the values of a liberal ideology, with the inequality of slavery written into our Constitution. It took more than a century after the Civil War before Congress passed the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and racism remains a major factor in American politics to this day. Americans have also differed over how to promote liberal values in foreign policy, and racism played a role in American interventions in Mexico, Haiti, and the Philippines. There are different variants of liberal moral energy. For some Americans, it became an excuse for invading other countries and imposing democracy, while for others it meant the creation of a system of international law and organization that protects domestic liberty by moderating international anarchy. Another strand of American exceptionalism lies in the religious roots in Scripture about being a chosen people and in the Puritan guilt of those who fled Britain in order to worship God in a purer way in a new world. Such high aspirations led to anxieties about whether they were living up to these impossible standards. This strand is less crusading than anxious and inward. Even the Founding Fathers worried whether their new republic would decline in virtue like the Roman Republic. In the 19th century, European visitors as diverse as Alexis de Tocqueville and Charles Dickens noted the American obsession about virtue, progress, and decline. But this moral concern was more inward than outward-looking. Finally, a third source of our exceptionalism arises from America's sheer size and location. Already in the 19th century, de Tocqueville noted America's special geographical situation. Protected by two oceans and bordered by weaker neighbors, the United States largely focused on westward expansion in the 19th century and tried to avoid entanglement in the global balance of power that was centered in Europe. But as the United States became the world's largest economy at the beginning of the 20th century, it began to think in terms of global power. As we have seen, the largest power has both more leeway and more opportunity to indulge itself, for good and for ill. The largest country also has the incentive and capability to take the lead in the creation of global public goods from which all can benefit, and the freedom to define its national interest in broad ways that include such goods as an open international trading system, freedom of the seas and other commons, and development of international institutions. Size creates an important realist basis for American exceptionalism, but Puritanism, and especially liberalism, provide the moral energy. Early in the 20th century, President Woodrow Wilson made an important effort to combine American liberal values with our new great power status. Wilsonian liberalism. Isolationism was our 19th century policy toward the global balance of power. The relatively weak American republic could be imperialistic toward its small neighbors, but had to follow a cautious realist policy toward the global balance of power in Europe. The Monroe Doctrine asserted the separation of the Western Hemisphere from the European balance, but the United States was able to maintain its assertion only because it coincided with British interests and the control of the seas by the Royal Navy. However, as American power grew, our options increased. An important turning point was in 1917, when Wilson broke with tradition and sent 2 million Americans to fight in Europe. Like other American leaders early in the 20th century, Wilson considered himself an idealist. Wilson was a liberal idealist, but he did not practice universal human rights. As a Southerner, he shared the racial prejudices, as well as the prevailing Anglo-Saxon chauvinism of his times, and the American liberal tradition had long accommodated first slavery and then segregation. In addition, Wilson did not hesitate to intervene in Mexico and the Caribbean in response to what he considered their poor governance. His idea of an international league for peace started as a European concept, but as a leading American professor and college president, he adapted the European liberal ideas and synthesized them into what he considered a more moral American approach that became a major factor in American foreign policy. Wilson understood the concept of a balance of power, but he regarded it as immoral because it cut up weak nations like cheeses for the convenience of great powers, as Poland had been divided among Russia, Prussia, and Austria in the 18th century. Wilson believed that a League of Nations based on a collective security pact against aggressors would be more peaceful and just than the cynical alliances required to balance power. Wilson saw America's mission in World War I not as material aggrandizement, but as leading all nations into a new international community organized to achieve right ends. He called the United States an associate rather than an ally of the victorious powers. Wilson argued that this was the only kind of peace that would prove acceptable to the American people in the short run and to the moral opinion of the world in the long run. Where Wilson succeeded was not as a foreign policy leader, but as what we now call a thought leader. In 1919, when he was idolized both at home and abroad, and again decades later, he became a symbol of a new moral type of international relations. Wilson's ideas for international organization were not implemented by his countrymen for more than 2 decades. Nonetheless, Wilson strongly affected Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, who launched the liberal international order that prevailed after 1945. Both men considered themselves Wilsonians, and the United Nations, which restricts the grounds on which nations can go to war, is a descendant of Wilson's League of Nations. Wilson's liberal internationalist project had 2 main aims: to tame international anarchy through the erection of binding international law and organization, and to change the other states in the system toward constitutional democracy. He sought a world made safe for democracy. Historian and biographer Arthur Link has argued that in light of the catastrophic events of the 1930s, Wilson's moral vision at Versailles in 1919 was more farsighted than those of the European leaders Georges Clemenceau or David Lloyd George, who focused on territorial gains. Link called this the higher realism of Woodrow Wilson, and no less a realist than George Kennan wrote of Wilson in 1991, "I have to correct or modify at this stage of my life many of the impressions I had about him at an earlier stage. In his vision of the future needs of world society, I now see Wilson as ahead of any other statesman of his time." Others disagree and believe that the moralistic liberal legacy that Wilson bequeathed has been a trap for American foreign policy. While liberal democracy is the best political system at home, in the realm of international politics, the belief that all humans have a set of inalienable rights and that protecting these rights should override other concerns creates a powerful incentive for liberal states to intervene. Liberalism becomes a source of instability and conflict. Of course, much depends on the definition of liberalism and how it is implemented. But as Henry Kissinger noted, even the ultimate realist, Richard Nixon, was influenced by Wilson and hung his picture in the White House. Kissinger concluded that Wilson's ultimate greatness must be measured by the degree to which he rallied the tradition of American exceptionalism, a prophet toward whose vision America has judged itself obliged to aspire. The liberal international order after 1945. After Wilson sent 2 million men to fight in Europe and tipped the outcome of the war, it was clear that the United States was not only the world's largest economy, but also crucial to the global balance of power. But when the Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and Wilson's League of Nations, the United States failed to act in its new role and instead continued to behave as a free rider in the provision of global public goods, which Britain could no longer afford to do. In the absence of a global government, the world depends on the largest country to provide order and global public goods, and in the 19th century the Pax Britannica contributed security, economic stability, and protection of global commons, such as freedom of the seas. After World War I, the United States had replaced Britain as the indispensable nation, to use a phrase from the end of the century, but did not see itself that way. Instead, America returned to normalcy. While the United States took some useful initiatives in the 1920s, public opinion came to see intervention in World War I and efforts to create a world order as a huge mistake. The United States became strongly isolationist, and there was no American-led liberal order in the 1930s. The result was an immoral decade of economic depression, a prelude to genocide, and eventually a Second World War. While the isolationism of the 1930s was more virulent than usual, it represented a return to the 19th century foreign policy tradition. American public opinion often oscillates between extroversion and retrenchment. Leaders like Franklin Roosevelt saw the mistakes of 1930s isolationism and began a planning process to create the Bretton Woods international economic institutions in 1944 and the United Nations in 1945. As we shall see in Chapter 3, the turning point was Harry Truman's post-war decisions that led to permanent alliances and a continual military presence abroad. When Britain was too weak to support Greece and Turkey in 1947, the United States took its place. We invested heavily in the Marshall Plan in 1948, created NATO in 1949, and led a United Nations coalition that fought in Korea in 1950. In 1960, Dwight Eisenhower signed a new security treaty with Japan. These actions were part of a realist strategy of containment of Soviet power, but containment was interpreted in various ways. Some foreign policy choices were justified on the basis of containing communism and others on containing the Soviet Union. Witness Truman's support of communist Yugoslavia. Some decisions had questionable ethical justification, such as overthrow of governments in Guatemala, Iran, and elsewhere. Perhaps the most notorious was the intervention in Vietnam, which, as we will see in Chapter 4, a series of American presidents justified with a metaphor of dominoes falling to communism and the ultimate effect on the global balance of power in a bipolar world. Americans had bitter debates and partisan differences over intervention in developing countries like Vietnam and, more recently, Iraq, which strongly affected the 1968 and 2006 elections, respectively. But while the ethics of intervention were highly contentious, the issue of a liberal institutional order was much less so. The theologian Reinhold Niebuhr praised the fortunate vagueness of liberal internationalism, which saved it from ideological rigidity. With victory in the Cold War and the ideological victory of liberalism, Wilsonianism ran the risk of becoming a hard ideology of making the world safe by democracy rather than for democracy. America's unipolar moment of unbalanced power raised the risk of hubris. Washington's advocacy for economic globalization, forceful democracy promotion, and American leadership often became an ideological justification for a rigid set of interests. The pursuit of exalted ends empowers the United States to employ whatever means it deems necessary. The liberal international order had enjoyed broad support in American foreign policy since World War II, but in the 2016 election, Donald Trump discovered the effectiveness of an argument that the alliances and institutions of the post-1945 order had let other peoples benefit to the disadvantage of the United States. His populist appeal rested on far more than foreign policy. The economic dislocations caused by globalism were accentuated by the 2008 Great Recession, and cultural changes related to race, the role of women, and gender identity had polarized the American electorate. Trump successfully linked white resentment over the increasing visibility and influence of racial and ethnic minorities to foreign policy by blaming economic problems on bad trade deals with countries like Mexico and China and on immigrants competing for jobs. The current period is not the first time America has seen such populist reactions against a liberal foreign policy. There were antecedents in the 1920s and 1930s. 15 million immigrants had come to the United States in the first 20 years of the century, leaving Native Americans with a vague, uneasy fear of being overwhelmed from within. In the early 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan had a resurgence and pushed for the National Origins Act of 1924 to prevent the Nordic race from being swamped and preserve the older, more homogeneous America they revered. Similarly, Donald Trump's election in 2016 reflected rather than caused the deep racial, ideological, and cultural schisms that had been developing since the 1960s. Some analysts worried that Trump's foreign policies and American retrenchment could result in international disorder similar to the 1930s, but his supporters argued to the contrary, that a less generous and tougher U.S. stance would produce greater stability abroad and greater domestic support at home. In any case, Trump's election represented a clear shift away from the Wilsonian tradition. Some believe that Trump's rise was caused by the failure of liberal elites to reflect the underlying foreign policy preferences of the American people. Stephen Walt, for example, portrays a moralistic foreign policy elite that cares more about liberal values than does the public at large. But this portrait is oversimplified. Of course, there are many strands in American public opinion, and elite groups are generally more interested in foreign policy than the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?